women serving in the church. I stand here today on the shoulders of some awesome women that I have read about, women that I have worked with, women that are sitting in this church today. It is amazing when we think about what the women did in 1823 when the church came together, when some people came together, 23 people. A lot of them were women. One of them I've been able to research was the wife of William Welch. She was 18 years old and had a baby with her. So, she had several children, of course, later, but they were very involved in the life of the church. And when you think about those women coming in 1823, how did they get down to that little building by the railroad track? On horseback, a wagon, a buggy. 1823, just think about it, 200 years ago. So there is a verse that if I can quickly come up with it, but it's not going to happen. Anyway, that I wanted to read you. Women were just so strong and so amazing, and they connected, and they worshiped the Lord. They studied the Word, and we lack the records of the first 20 years of details of how the men and women conducted the business of the church. But it is amazing what we have and what we've learned. One of the men that was a charter member, Eli Barker Heron, had several children, and one of them was James Pinckney Heron, and he married Molly Smathers, and they had children. He even bought the Mountaineer one time in the early 1890s. It was called the Courier then. But Molly and the women had an interest in missions. What did they know about missions in the 1890s? There were women in this nation who had a love for Jesus, and they wrote letters. They didn't send an email, and they didn't send a text. They wrote letters, and one of the first letter writers that we have records of is Lottie Moon, who was in China, who needed help, and she wrote letters. She wrote letters to Annie Armstrong. She wrote letters. And Fannie Heck, who lived in Raleigh, she wrote letters. They organized. Yes, they met in the basement when the men would gather for the Southern Baptist Convention in Virginia. They met in the basement of a Methodist church down the street. They could not be in those meetings, so they could not vote. So these women inspired our women like Molly Heron. Molly Heron's daughter was Lucille Foy. Lucille was born in 1899, and she passed away in 1985. Her son was Henry Foy. And Henry Foy, a lot of you don't know, you didn't know Henry. He died 8 years ago. He was an amazing man in this church. His mother kept lots of records. She wrote lots of minutes. On the front of your insert, you will see a picture of Molly Heron and her daughter, Lucille Heron. And when I came to Waynesville in 1961, a lady invited me to a circle meeting. It was maybe like in 62. I was 22, so now you can figure out how old I am. But anyway, I went to Miss Lucille Foy's home, and Henry and his family were living in the big house there on Welch Street, and they had built her a beautiful cottage. And she was showing me pictures of her granddaughters, Molly, Jessie, and Lucia. And Molly was the last baby. She was the third one, and I got a lot of this information from Molly. But when I think about Lucille's commitment to keeping notes and minutes of this church, and that's what we have learned a lot of our information about the family. So when you think about this woman, Molly Herron. She was the president of their WMS, their missionary society. And they met every month and kept detailed records. Those women kept minutes. I've read them. I've read Lucille Foy's minutes of detailed minutes when they met in the 40s. And they couldn't have the anniversary of the organization of our church in 1823. They were having a celebration in 1948. It was canceled. You remember some of you could remember what was happening in 1948? Polio. So you couldn't have any gatherings. I remember that very well. Couldn't go to the pool. So, women have served in every way imaginable. The window, and I don't know if we have a picture of the stained glass window. Thank you. The stained glass window that you see is in our chapel. How did that window get there to our chapel? Why do we have written on the screen, to the glory of God and the memory of those women who helped? That statement, that window, was planned and put in the church that they built in 1905. And how did they build this church? They were always needing to raise money. They were down on Church Street in a little white building, popping at the seams. And there was a cemetery around the church. They had a small plot, and it was getting full, and they didn't have any way to add on. The church bell, by the way, was in that church, and Ashley will tell you about that next week. But anyway, so they wanted to build a new church. They bought property right here on Main Street on the corner, and the pastor of the church asked the women to help them raise money, and they did. They did everything to raise money. And they started the church in 1905, and these stained glass windows that we have in our chapel were in that church. And they were saved, thankfully, for the wisdom of those who did that. But the women did. They had bake sales, they had dinners, they served. They just did everything they could, and you'll learn another way that they raised money next week. So when we think about, as we come through to the 60s and 70s, there was a lady that was here when I came, and her name was Ms. Morgan, and she sat right down here. She always wore black. She was just a pillar of the church. But in 1914, she wanted to give the missions report of what the women were doing in church, in the church. She asked for permission. A woman had never done that before. And they gave it to her. And so, and then as we look around today, we've had women move to this church, move to this area, and in 5 minutes, they're busy, and because they love the Lord, and they want to do what the Lord has called them to do. And the women of this church are so thankful for this church that we have had that opportunity to bloom where we've been planted, to be allowed to serve in the ways that God has called us. So, in closing, and I know I've gone over my time probably, one thing I have not mentioned are, there's 3 things that our church has in their DNA: studying God's Word, listening to the proclamation of His Word. Music has always been part of our DNA. Missions stands out. We have had a lot of folks be called to serve by going on mission trips and coming back and inspiring us. And we've not just done it in Africa and Honduras and Albania. We've done it in this country. A group went to Coburn. We went to Coburn, Virginia, those folks that had worked in the mine, in mining. And so they were so desperate people. And our church did a good work there. And now we're planning another good work. So it is amazing when I think about, and our women have been very generous through the years, not only with their time, their skills, but their tithes and offerings over and above. So I am thankful for the women that have served. They have been awesome role models for me. And I thank you for the time that we've had this morning to focus on the women in our church.